I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this Word in Your Ear podcast, videocast, thing for which there is no name. Mark Ellen and I have been creating in this line since 2007. And if any of it has met with your approval, then please click to subscribe because it helps. Leave a comment because we like to hear from you, and maybe even consider becoming a Patreon supporter because then, well, you'll be one of us. Visit patreon.com/wordinyourear for details.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
It was 40 years ago today, give or take, since Live Aid. So we thought we'd obviously mark the occasion by putting together the fragments of our old fading memories, but also inviting in friend of the pod, Boyd Hilton. Boyd, if he's not on telly, he's watching telly. So, you know, And I saw Boyd the other day and he said, I've just been watching a 3-hour documentary or whatever it was, however long it was, about Live Aid, which is on this weekend, I think, isn't it? But when is it?
Yes, it starts Sunday, yes. And it's Live Aid When Rock and Roll Took Over the World is the full title.
Well, and because we've seen that this weekend, another thing we want to touch on is, you know, you would believe that's true following the coverage of Oasis, the Oasis return, which started last night. Of course, we're a week away from the Glastonbury to-do, which concerned the BBC and live music. First of all, let me take you both back. I want to see what you can remember about 1985 and how life was different in 1985. Okay, Mark Ellen, how many channels of television were there in Britain in 1985?
Well, it was certainly 4.
There were 4.
I think, had Channel 4 started? Yeah, I think I'm saying 4.
There were 4. So BBC 1, BBC 2, ITV, and Channel 4. There'd been a cup final at Wembley, Boyd, just about a month or so before Live Aid. I don't expect you to know off the top of your head. I know you follow football. But it was between Everton and Man United. Okay?
Yeah.
How many overseas players were involved in that game?
Oh, that's good. That's good. 2.
1.
That's amazing.
Wow. Jesper Olsen.
Yeah,
1.
Fantastic.
Danish, you know.
Yeah.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And I think only one person of colour.
Wow.
Paul McGrath, which is just absolutely extraordinary.
That's astonishing, isn't it?
And further details, how many substitutes could you have in the cup final in those days?
3?
2?
1.
1? Really? God.
It doesn't seem possible that you could actually complete a game of football with only...
So if two people got injured, you'd have to play with 10 men.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
If a
amazing.
goalkeeper, somebody would, go in goal or whatever. So could you still smoke on the London Underground?
Yes.
In 1985, you could.
You couldn't smoke on the trains. They just stopped smoking on the trains in late 1984, which is extraordinary.
Because they used to have smoking carriages. Do you remember that?
They
and you
did.
could walk into them and you could tell just by the aroma, like going into hotel rooms, just reeked of old
But you could
stale
smoke
fags.
you could smoke on the platforms.
Wait, absolutely. So
Right.
what people did, and we must be able to remember this, people got off the train at Oxford Circus or whatever, and the first thing they did was light a cigarette. didn't they?
Yes.
And which obviously is what led to the appalling, the King's Cross fire. Not long afterwards, was caused by people not smoking on trains.
On a wooden escalator.
On a wooden escalator as they went up there.
You could also smoke in the TV studio where you were hosting Live Aid as well, let me say, because there's various clips of people smoking live on TV in the documentary.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Ian Astbury. I'm giving away some of the secrets already of the show, but Ian Astbury is smoking a fag next to you while you're hosting the show.
I'd forgotten that.
Is he smoking the fag when he's actually on air? I mean, is he actually dragging the cigarette?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think of it so far?
Yeah,
well,
literally.
I don't know. I thought the Pretenders were quite good.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
That's extraordinary. The final question about 1985. How much was a ticket for Live Aid?
Oh, I know this.
I know this, yeah.
Go on.
Well, £25.
£25.
25 quid, and that was considered at the time to be pretty steep, I remember.
Very
But
steep.
then they were said that it's steep, but don't forget half of that or whatever goes to the charity. Looking back at it now, it was £25 for that lineup is ludicrous.
Yeah. So the whole crowd must have been, if you think, kind of middle class white people, which it seems to be if you kind of cut to the crowd.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you read Dylan Jones wrote a book about 1985, came out a couple of years ago, because Dylan was there in the crowd on that day, and he makes the point that there were a crowd such as you wouldn't find at anything else. They were what's the word? Ecumenical, or they weren't just U2 fans or whoever. Yeah. There were people who'd gone, and they gave everybody a fair shake. They just had a different attitude,
Yeah, they were just as pleased to see Status Quo and Sade as they were, Paul McCartney and Queen, weren't they?
Yeah, a lot of the acts say stuff like, "This isn't our crowd." I think Queen. The members of Queen are like, this wasn't our crowd, but we kind of agreed to do it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Boyd, going back, where were you at the time?
How old were you at that?
I was 18.
Right.
And I was on a weekend kind of holiday with some friends to a town on the Thames Estuary, I think somewhere. And we had portable television in the kitchen of where we were staying. It was like the equivalent of a B&B back then, an Airbnb back then. I don't even remember how we managed to find this place to stay, but I was obsessed with making sure we could watch it. Really? This was a massive event for me. I just thought this is huge. And so sure enough, we had a TV, plonked it in the middle of the kitchen table and watched it throughout the whole thing. As I certainly did. I think other people wandered in and out, and
So did they all immediately realise that something was developing? Because that was the feeling. We didn't know. We thought it was going to be it was going to do well, but suddenly, after about an hour or two, you got the feeling this was going to be immense.
Yeah, I remember thinking, it's a bit annoying that we're going away this weekend. We'd planned it, for a couple of weeks before. And everyone was like, well, it's okay, we can watch it. We'll get TV, we can watch it, it's fine. I think I was the most concerned about missing out. Even back then, I've always had this fear of missing out on something, a big cultural event.
Before it was invented.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, no, we've got to get a TV. And I remember, I distinctly also remember watching the whole show, and a lot of the time people would, go away and do some cooking or come go. And I was like, no, I don't want to miss anything. Even the acts that I didn't like at all. I don't know, Nick Kershaw or someone. You still didn't want to miss anything. You thought something might happen in this live. Because I don't remember there ever being the equivalent of a live broadcast.
This is...
16 hours or however long it was. The whole idea of it was just extraordinary.
That's the point. I think that's one of the key things that, it changed lots of things about music, but changed lots of things about television as well, didn't it? And, so if you look back to George Harrison, Concert for Bangladesh, 1971, Madison Square Garden, they did 2 shows, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. And then there was a film made, which I think was made with just 3 cameras, one of which didn't work properly. And so when we finally got to see it in the cinema months later, it was kind of blurry and not wildly impressive. You know what I mean? So there's no sense of this has all got to happen now. You know what I mean? It was all slow. Whereas with Bob Geldof and Live Aid, it was going to be something happen in the moment.
Yeah, and if anything went wrong with the Bangladesh thing, which it would have done, it didn't necessarily finish up in the film. But that was one of those exciting things on the day, was the things that went wrong. It was just, I can really remember that. From the inside, we were going to have a link. Do you know if you remember this, Dave? Going over to Trent Bridge with Ian Botham.
Yes.
Who was a huge star at the time. And Ian Botham was going to do a little speech about the charity, and that broke down. There was a link to Russia that broke down. There was the Concorde flight with Phil Collins on it, which, Dave, you were talking to Steve Blacknell, I think, halfway through your Tony Hancock impersonation.
Swapping arcane.
Send a tray of bread pudding to, Kuala Lumpur. It was. That broke down. And it was just things going wrong, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, there were certain, but they always managed to, it never broke down totally. or did it? I
There-
mean,
there's,
Who,
there is
The
a
Who.
moment. There's a moment, Dave, where you're handing over to Madonna in Philadelphia.
Oh, God, yeah.
And there's a delay. There is
Yes.
a delay. They show this bit in the documentary. I don't know whether it's to punish you or something, but you're kind of like, you're just, when is this going to happen? When are we going to see Madonna?
This is my opportunity to set the record straight on behalf of all people who've ever been involved in television presentation. Whenever anything, eggy moment is shown for a TV presenter, it is literally never the TV presenter's fault. It's always somebody else's, And basically what they were doing with that is they'd pretty much given up at that stage and telling you when it was going to be, when she was going to appear. You were just going to look at the monitor and decide. And then I saw this figure advancing in the middle of a bunch of Thompson twins. And I sort of said, oh, yes, that's Madonna. She appears to be there, kind of thing, So you had to play it by ear. Also, a lot of the time they had what they called open talkback. Now we all know presenters have in their earpiece where a talkback thing, and usually it's only activated when the director wants to talk to them. Whereas with Live Aid, you had open talkback, so you could hear all the directors all over the world talking to each other.
Yeah, all over the world. You hear the American ones too. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's insane. That is insane.
It was just you had to just absolutely do your best, with that. And of course, the other thing is we have to keep reminding ourselves. Going back to the, how long it's been since 1985. This is the old Wembley Stadium. That old concrete mausoleum. The least cheery, environment you can possibly imagine. And I was, up in what I used to call the Desline and Perspex box, suspended from the eaves of the old stadium, where Des Lynam and Jimmy Hill.
The commentary box, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, it wasn't usually summarizing. What the commentary was somewhere else. And to get to that position there, you had to take lifts, walkways, catwalks,
you went up
ladders.
little gantries, metal gantries.
Absolutely extraordinary, the length you had to go to. So anybody who was produced in there, any kind of, pop star, had an excuse for looking mildly disheveled because they had just undertaken a kind of a journey of almost John Noakes, extremity to get to the top
and
of
were
this.
perspiring heavily, weren't they?
Absolutely extraordinary,
The other thing about it being at old Wembley is if you look at the shots of the crowd, they are packed in, 72,000 people packed in. And nowadays, of course, they tailor it to, I don't know, Beyonce, and they kind of have a middle stage in the middle, and have lots of gaps. It's incredible to watch 72,000 people packed tight together in that heat watching that show. It looks completely different to how a Wembley show would look now.
And also, another note about 1985. This is only a few weeks, I think I'm right in saying, since Heysel in Brussels, and not long after the Bradford City fire. So, if ever there was a time when crowd safety would have been paramount, it was that time, So, and I also can't help reflecting on the fact that the whole thing was accomplished without recourse to a single mobile phone because
it was all done with walkie-talkies, wasn't
it? They hadn't been invented.
That is amazing.
It is astonishing.
I don't understand. They have some people on the document. They have a sound guy. The sound guy who's devastated because Paul McCartney's mic didn't work.
Oh, well, I bet.
I mean, that moment. He said, "I've never worked with him ever again." He was kind of blacklisted for that. But the technical, it's incredible how little went wrong, really, when you consider what an extraordinary technical challenge it must have been without being able to just text someone saying this is happening, Like, for example, I presume that's why no one came along to replace Paul McCartney's microphone, because no one was really aware of it, or basically because no one was texting each other to tell them this was happening.
I suppose so. And also you had these people appearing, David Bowie and whatever, flew in. People coming, helicopters were landing on local cricket pitches, weren't they?
Yeah.
How did that happen without anybody making a phone call saying we're taking off now or something like that?
Yeah, it was Noel Edmonds, wasn't it? Was flying
was it?
people. Noel Edmonds was the pilot. That was his contribution. And he flew people from Battersea Heliport, and they landed in a little cricket pitch. And extraordinary shots now and again of cricketers and women with kind of long dresses being blown in the downdraft of a landing aircraft that had kind of Bowie's backing band on it or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
At one point, Lenny Henry's pops up and he says he's just done a gig in Southend and he hotfoots it from Southend to Wembley. And you're thinking, how did that happen? The coordination of all these people kind of taking them out of there. And Queen, half of Queen, before they were due, about a couple of hours, they just left Wembley and started wandering around in the vicinity, just kind of hanging out, and just so they'd kind of deal with their nerves, basically. And who, again, without any mobile phones, how did someone say, "Look, come on, you got to get back to the stadium. You're about to go on." Yeah, exactly.
You see, I didn't feel. Mark and I were both picked up in BBC cars, taken to Wembley. And, so you were in there and, in my case, I was kind of wired in. You couldn't move. You had cabling you you were connected to the ground. The question of going to the lavatory, put it out of your mind. You're stuck there for like 5 hours or whatever. You're up in the gantry and so forth. And all I could note was the weather was lovely and it appeared to be going well. But as far as knowing anything about how the outside world was receiving anything, you didn't. Nowadays, you would.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. I'm fascinated to know the two of you. Were you all? So Queen undoubtedly, it's just fact now, isn't it? That they had the biggest uplift. Yeah. They were the biggest surprise in just what a thrilling show they put on. But were you two aware of how well they went down and just how brilliant everyone thought they were?
Well, we were aware of Queen going down well, weren't we, Dave?
Queen was going down well. I mean, as far as the whole event was concerned, I'll tell you, it wasn't until I got back home, which must have been 3:00 or something like that in the morning, and my wife was sitting up in bed, said, "Well, that was something," and that was. I thought, oh, really? She said, "Oh, yes, my mum and dad had been on the phone. They were watching it, whatever." So you suddenly had a sense of how it had landed in 1,000 living rooms and back gardens and so forth. But that slowly crept up on me,
Well, there was one moment I can remember on the broadcast, because at Word magazine on the anniversary, I don't know what it had been, the 20th or something like that, I got out the tapes. I still had the tapes and went through them, and just to correct all the misunderstandings about what Bob had said and all that. And there's a bit where Dave is on live, and Dave says, "Bob has just told me that we're on 95% of television sets in the world, which makes me feel a little bit ill, actually." Those are exactly your words, Dave.
Great.
So that was the extraordinary thing, was that's kind of obviously utter nonsense.
Yeah, how does it
For me, my experience of it, I was presenting the American bit, from not actually at Wembley, but at the club afterwards down in Regent Street. So I was in the American leg, and we were just about to go on, and I was told in my earpiece that there were over 2 billion people watching.
Wow.
And I remember thinking two things. One is, that's not helping me at all.
No, it doesn't help.
When you're about to do a link to on live television. And the other was, I remember turning to somebody and saying, "What's a billion?" Because we didn't know what a billion was. Was that 10 million? Was it 100 million? And was it 1,000 million? And did it really matter? It's obviously a lot of people.
Yeah.
But no, the answer to that is no, we had no idea. But we were given the impression that we should tell the outside world that it was huge and go on building that idea to give the just to help the spread the idea that it was that it was enormous and it was a huge event. Yeah, but we didn't know, really.
No. There's a moment where they show you chatting to Sade.
Oh yes,
Mark.
I did.
Yeah, so is that not at the stadium? That was at this.
No, I can't remember. They're in a club now. It was somewhere in Regent Street. It's called something like Blades. We couldn't remember, could we, Dave? No. But yeah, that was Sade. I mean, I had to fill before going to the American stuff. So we had Duncan Goodhue, and we had Sue Pollard. We had David Essex. I don't know what David Essex was doing. He was in Mutiny on the Bounty around the corner.
Fantastic.
What he wandered in.
Yeah.
Cliff Richard. And then I got to, Brian May and Sade and various other people, but it was quite funny. We were just having to fill, as you did a lot of the time, Dave. You're waiting for the acts to come on.
Well, that's the thing.
You've got to fill.
So we're up in there. It's funny you should mention Ian Astbury because, I was my main memory is I was up there. Paul Gambaccini, I think, was on at the same time as me, and a variety of ever-changing sofa full of guests that they kept restocking. So assistant producers would descend down the walkways and the catwalks, and they'd re-emerge triumphantly wielding Andrew Ridgely or Fish or, as Mark says,
look what I found,
Duncan Goodhue or whatever. And this is no word of a lie. When Ian Astbury was kind of shoved on the end of the sofa while I was talking to somebody else, I just looked over and thought, who's that? and I waited until I was off camera, and I gestured to one of the producers, May Miller. I said, "Who's that?" Pointed and she no word of a lie again. She did the international, recognized gesture for puzzlement, like, I don't know.
Well, I had a similar experience.
He just looked like a rock star. He was wearing a big felt hat, I think.
Yes. I had a similar experience watching this documentary because they're showing the moment where Bob tells you to forget the address, fuck the address.
Yeah.
That moment is you've got Billy Connolly and Pamela Stevenson and Ian Astbury.
Right.
Yeah, that's the lineup at that moment, and so and that's when you see Ian Astbury smoking. That's so I was
really?
So I was watching this documentary, going, "Who is that smoking in the middle of this moment?"
Yeah, that's much more shocking than somebody saying "fuck."
And then and then I managed to work it out who it was. That it was Ian Astbury. Yes, so it was mysterious that he was there at all. Yeah,
but it's worth recapping once again as to why the famous "fuck the address" thing happened, because it does indicate how different the world of communications was. The BBC, and we had a pep talk the day before the event on the Friday at Johnny Beerling's office at Radio 1. Johnny Beerling was controller of Radio 1 at the time. And all the presenters were all in there, and about 30 of us in this office. And one thing they were trying to din into us was, this is not a telethon. This is not the BBC finally deciding to do a Jerry Lewis style, annual, let's raise a load of money for something. Because if we give in to this, we'll have, I don't know, Dr. Bernardo's or Oxfam turning up the week after. So the way people were encouraged to donate was in 3 stages. The first was that you could send a check or a postal order to an address. Imagine this.
Incredible.
Get out a pencil and paper. Nothing brings back 1985 more than that.
An envelope.
Right.
Yeah.
There you go. Send off a check to this. And then the second one, you could, if you were overcome with the desire to do something immediately, you could go to your local post office and you can make a payment over the counter. And then if you had one of those things that I believe they're called credit cards, here's the telephone number. Those were the 3 stages. That's how people did things in those days, And talk about how Live Aid changed the face of charity. The face of charity used to be a kindly faced elderly lady stopping you in the high street with a tin, didn't it? Into which you put 50p or whatever. Post Live Aid, the face of charity was a studio full of celebrities haranguing you to do something right now. You know what I mean? It was extraordinary. So, with Geldof, I said, well, okay, because I knew what order the things came up in. Address first. And he goes, fuck the address.
That's exactly what happened. And you made a point, Dave, I remember saying, and if you have a credit card, and not everybody does.
Yeah.
I remember you actually saying that. And you're so reminded watching, I'm sure I'm going to be again watching the documentary, just what a clunky old analog world it was. There's a bit where Paula Yates is interviewed, and she says, He said, "Oh, the phones have never stopped ringing in our house all week." He said, "I know. We're very flash." He says, "We've got 2 phones." It's the idea she's got 2 landlines. You know, obviously there's no mobile phones. It's extraordinary.
No, this is it. So tell us about the documentary that you've spent 3 hours watching.
Well, just one more thing about the Geldof moment is that what really made me laugh is he's saying, give us the money, just give us the money. And you're saying, I've got to give the address first off.
Right.
And you're very, very firm about that. I've got...
Yeah.
And he goes, fuck the address. And then you carry on. You say, I think we're still going to have the address first off. That's what you say. I wrote it down. And then by this point, Geldof's practically, he's practically having an aneurysm because you're so insistent on going to the address first. It's hilarious.
Because I know that's the order that the captions are going to come up in.
You're doing your job. You're doing your job. And he is hysterical.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
God.
But the thing watching the documentary, the thing that really I kind of knew vaguely, but everyone underlines is that the whole thing, they were not getting much money. And that's why he was so angry. And then the turning point was when they played the video of the cars driving.
Cars.
Yeah.
That's completely it. And David Bowie, in fact, gave up one of the songs on his set, having seen it.
Yeah. And on the documentary, they show that just the effect that it had on the crowd, on the audience. And the money immediately started flowing in, and that was just made. It wasn't even made by the BBC or
Canadian
ABC.
Broadcasting.
A Canadian broadcaster did it off their own bat, and someone just said, "Oh, by the way, have you seen this video?"
But how bizarre an idea is that?
Right.
Let's take a montage of harrowing pictures of starving children.
Yeah.
And let's put it to a pop record. Oh, I tell you what, Drive by the Cars.
Incredible.
Such
It's
an
just
unlikely
an extraordinary thing. It's not even as if it's kind of, I don't know, give peace a chance or whatever.
Yeah. And then when they plays out, and then they cut back to you in the studio again, and it's quite moving because Billy Connolly's in tears. Billy Connolly.
I remember he was crying when he came back again.
Yeah.
And that was a very emotional bit of TV.
Yeah, completely.
We had no idea what we were going to see at all. And it was Pamela Stevenson and Billy Connolly.
Yeah. And they also, what they do in the documentary is they speak to Birhan Woldu, who was the young girl who was literally on the verge of death in that, glimpsed in that video, and she's there as an adult, and then on Live 8, remember she performed with Madonna. Madonna got her on stage.
Oh, of course.
So she became this world renowned figure who was just glimpsed in that Cars video during Live Aid. So that is an extraordinary moment. She is really emotional about it, understandably, and how much it changed her life. So there's extraordinary kind of stories.
So that's the child in the video.
Yeah, the child in the video. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
God.
And she was literally on the verge of starvation, and this one of the nurses took hold of her and made sure she was fed. Yeah, it's quite incredible. Yeah.
Right. So how does it come over musically?
Well, what's interesting musically, I remember you saying this. I think you talked about Live Aid on the Word podcast maybe a year or two, a couple of years ago, and I remember you talking about how it was a great day for the old acts, for the legacy acts as we call them now, and honestly, the marked difference between even Status Quo, right? Status Quo, come on,
fantastic,
rocking all over the world, brilliant. It sounds amazing. Loads of guitars, they're singing in tune. It's a great, catchy song. Then you cut to next on the bill is the Style Council, right? And all the love in the world. I love Paul Weller and I love the Jam and I love the Style Council to some extent. But they do like an album track, among their 4 songs, 2 album tracks, I think, in fact. But the sound is so thin already in comparison to Status Quo. And you have glimpses of, Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran and Ultravox. You only get glimpses of them in the documentary. I actually was so inspired by watching it that I went to look at the YouTube channel. You can watch pretty much every performance on YouTube, the Live YouTube channel. And I watched some of them. And the performances by the classic 80s pop acts, those acts, are by and large, they sound awful. They just don't sound very good. And whereas the Queens, U2 sound great, but at that point, I think they were, fairly established rock, a force in the rock world. So it's just like the acts that are guitars, lots of guitars. And I think it goes back to what you're talking about, linking it to Oasis, last night doing their thing. Oasis augment themselves with like 2 or 3 other musicians. So they've got a big sound and it sounds fantastic. Whereas all the synth-based, new romantic bands, it all sounds a bit thin and weedy.
No, it's bass, drums, it's guitars. That gives it that kind of 3-dimensional sound in a big stadium like that. You're absolutely right. I remember Ultravox feeling very weedy on the
very.
And also, those acts, I think, don't come across quite as charismatically because they're not used to that scale of event. They've never played anything like that. Whereas at least Status Quo, those guys have been going forever. Queen have played huge crowds. They're used to it.
And I think it changed because I remember it changing my mind. I was one of those people who, I was 18. I loved all those bands that arrived in the new romantic era, so to speak. Visage, huge fan of Visage, etc. But none of that.
I can't even say it without laughing.
I know, it's hilarious.
You don't hear that very often.
It's a nightclub in Gants Hill, by the way, as well. But I went to see loads of live shows. OMD and Japan and Simple Minds. Simple Minds are on the bill at Live Aid in Philadelphia, and again, who weren't very good, I have to say. And the thing that I always came away with a slight feeling of disappointment because they could never match the studio work on the production of the studio work on their albums and their singles, whereas U2 and Queen and Status Quo and Paul McCartney and all of that, they didn't need that. They were just... So the difference between being great live and being quite bad live, I think, is really marked in kind of those two. And I think it was almost the death of new romanticism and those backs because they just couldn't tour convincingly. And when you saw them, it was kind of an inevitable disappointment. And a Live Aid, I think, really underlines that.
It's also, you can't have new romantic acts in the daylight, can you?
No, well, by the way,
they don't work. They're a nightclub concept.
It's a brilliant point because those acts are wearing heavy coats. Midge is wearing some kind of like massive,
he's wearing an ankle-length sort of Macintosh or something.
In the heat, and he's sweating.
Yeah,
and he's almost like, what are you doing wearing that coat? And there's at least, I think, 2. I think Tony Hadley's also wearing a massive leather coat. They're all look ridiculous. And it all started to kind of curdle, I think, in a way, those acts. At Live Aid, I didn't really do them any favors. I remember Boy George wouldn't do it. He said he knew that Culture Club and he wouldn't sound great in that context, and so he refused to do it. I think probably quite wisely.
Yes, very wisely.
Very wisely. Yeah. Did they include Adam Ant in it?
Yes. Well, you see,
Adam Ant was a key moment. We all thought we always thought he only got in because Miles Copeland managed Sting, and I think they said if you want Sting, you're probably going to have to add him because he wasn't that big a deal at the time. But he came on. He either did 1 or 2, maybe just one song. He did Vive La Rock.
Yeah, one new song.
They came on, here's my new single. Played a song nobody had heard.
Incredible.
How that was ever allowed to happen is unbelievable.
Well, funny thing, the other thing is that a lot of those acts, including Adam Ant, they don't really. You see glimpses of Adam Ant, but they all chose to do new stuff. Like they did. Most of them do 3 or 4 songs, right? And most of them do 2 or 3 classics and but they all have one new bit and they're all introduced. Like I think in the middle of Duran Duran, he goes, "This is our new single," and you're like, no. Whereas again, all the old acts just stuck with their tried and tested songs. So it's interesting that, of course, the U2 bit is fascinating because when they do Bad and Bono tries to go into the audience to dance with this girl, that is a calamity because it ruins the whole thing. They cut a song, the band don't know what's happening. That is and Bono, to his credit in the documentary, is very funny about it. He's like, the band wanted to sack me after that.
This is it. I mean, they said they didn't speak afterwards, did they?
They didn't. They flew back to Ireland and they didn't speak on the plane. I was right down the front watching that very closely, and it was what was extraordinary was that, again, technically, that the 3 other members of the group couldn't see what had happened to him. And obviously they couldn't speak to anybody because they're playing musical instruments. And they thought at one point that maybe what happened is he'd just fallen off the stage or something and was injured and was just not going to return. So they didn't know. They couldn't see any monitors either. They couldn't see any monitors. They had no idea what had happened to him. And they were just absolutely mortified.
Yeah. But I remember watching that on this TV on the kitchen table and thinking, what is Bono doing, as a viewer? And you're like, how long is this going to go on? Because it goes on for ages. That he's trying to get to this girl that he's singled out and decided to hug and dance with.
Did they interview the girl? They should have tracked the girl down.
No, annoyingly, that would have
been good.
Yeah, that would have been amazing. Yeah, I'm sure they tried. I'm sure they tried to find her.
Yeah,
but all those kind of gestures become massively important, don't they? Because my theory about Live Aid is it's not music at all. It's spectacle. It's what it looks like.
Yes.
But nobody's going, oh, they're really good on the middle eight of so-and-so. I thought the version of so-and-so was really good. Nobody's thinking that at all. They're thinking, look at these gestures that were made. Look at this person with that person. Even going back to things like, you've mentioned it already, status quo. Rocking all over the world is such a perfect way to start that thing.
Yeah,
just beyond perfect.
Yeah, it's like Oasis started there too with "It's good to be hello, it's good to be back."
Hello, I know.
That is a brilliant similar. That reminded me of that choice. That is just the right choice. It's just completely kind of overwhelmingly fun thing to do.
You would never have thought the most inspired. Song choice of the day was made by Francis Ross in Ring.
Right.
And also, you forget that there are only two reactions to status quo. One is that you like them anyway, and the other is you'd forgotten that you liked them.
Yeah.
And we're reminded of it because nobody doesn't like status quo.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Actually, was I think the game changing effect it had on people like me, young pretentious idiots who like music, who thought that status quo and Queen were completely uncool and embarrassing. At that point, Queen, I remember thinking, oh, they're awful. Who wants to see them? And then it literally changed your mind. You thought it opened your mind to the fact that their talent and their skill as showmen, as you say, as putting on a spectacle. And I remember even like Phil Collins. Phil Collins was huge. He was like the most mainstream act of the time, and everyone looked down their noses at him. People like me did. I was like, oh, Phil Collins, he's an idiot, and all his music is completely mainstream and bland, But then you watched him actually perform those songs, then go on Concorde and go do more in Philadelphia. And I thought a huge admiration for him. Suddenly, like, oh yeah, and I remember literally going out to buy No Jacket Required, the next day, I think, or whatever the album it was.
Well, he's still a bit sore about it all. I interviewed him not that long ago, and he was still sore about the whole Concorde thing because
why?
He thought that. He was doing a brilliant thing. It was part of the whole idea of promoting Live Aid. It was a news story. It was going to get the message out and help raise money. And people just somehow decided that it was a kind of totally selfish, self-regarding, self-promoting maneuver for him to get on a plane and then go and play on both stages at the same event, And he really got duffed up. I mean, had there been social media at the time, I'm sure it would have been infinitely worse. But
had there been social media, this is another point about this.
Yes.
Would Live Aid or anything comparable be possible nowadays? I would say no, because this only happened in the first place because Bob Geldof happened to be sitting at home watching the 6 o'clock news when everybody watched the same 6 o'clock news and picked up a phone and called half a dozen mates or whatever and made a record happen, which was only a hit because he could pick up a phone to Michael Grade and say, will you clear 5 minutes to Top of the Pops, or whatever he did. All these things could be done in the old world. They couldn't be done nowadays, could they? It doesn't seem to me at all.
I think you're right. Yeah, and just the logistics is what the key for me of the whole thing. The revolving stage, right? Yes. Which was an extraordinary thing to even think of doing, but it did work in the sense that there weren't gaps. There weren't big gaps. If you look at BBC's Glastonbury coverage, as I watch quite a lot of, there's loads. Obviously, there's a huge amount of time between each act because they have to get their own stuff, on stage, and they're all their own lighting and their own video screens or whatever they're doing. And there's huge gaps at Glastonbury. I mean, it obviously doesn't matter because you go to another stage, etc. But that idea, whoever came with that idea to have the revolving stage show, you have very little time between acts. It kind of seems to go on at a rolling. I'll tell you
what it was like. It was a high-tech version of the old package tour experience of the 60s,
yes.
which was the band went off, and somebody was setting up the next band behind the curtains. Then they opened the curtains and there they were playing straight away. Then that went away for years.
Yeah.
It was artificially revived by Live Aid. So now, 40 years later, since 40 years since Live Aid established the big spectacular rock event as being an absolutely key thing that television, it became a content pole of television, didn't it? It was one of those things that television did. We have Oasis going on tour starting this week, and that's all over the news and absolutely. And again, the television is just obsessed with the scale of it, isn't it? Really, That's what it shows you, just as thousands and thousands of people all acting the same. Television loves that idea, doesn't it?
Completely, yeah. Like you reminded of the Radio Gaga, clap along, and to watch and you watched the shots of the crowd. I watched lots of shots of the crowd, various kind of videos taken by people in the crowd at the first Oasis concert last night as we're recording this. And they were just all singing along with every single song. And I think Noel Gallagher's talked before about how you just have to start Don't Look Back in Again. Everyone sings the whole thing. And watching 72,000 people singing the same thing is immensely powerful and kind of thrilling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though I mainly want to see...
If they redid it now live, Ed, it would be so much more drone shots.
Oh,
that's the thing.
Sure.
It's the aerials, the scale. Dave's absolutely right. It's scale because a lot of it's just close-ups, actually, people on stage. And it's only when you see a shot from the side of the stage or the back of the stage and you see projected behind them, the audience, that you really, really find it exciting. Otherwise, it could be anywhere,
Yeah. Oh, Glastonbury, they show loads of shots, don't they, of the crowd and kind of swooping over the pyramid stage. And
Somerset in the background and the tour in the distance and the stars and the moon, absolutely.
So they haven't done anything about the banners at Glastonbury, which always seems like the most stupid thing to me.
And they haven't. And of course, there's a banner at Live Aid. I think maybe it's Queen. Someone has a flag. Someone's waiting. And I think, maybe this was the start of the flags and the banners. Because I hadn't seen that before that. Yeah, and they're everywhere. And of course, now they're a nightmare for the BBC because there's loads of, Palestinian flags.
Oh, right.
Yeah. God, yes.
Yeah, Glastonbury was full of that. Yeah,
there was a great flag at Glastonbury, I think, which simply said, ban the flags or stop the flags or something. So that was really, really
That's
good.
Brilliant, yeah.
It was.
Really fun, yeah.
So what do we all think about how the BBC has belatedly responded to what happened with its coverage of Glastonbury this year? Or is it just inevitable those kind of things are going to happen?
I think it's inevitable, isn't it? I think they talked about, 4,000, I think, something like that, acts or 4,000 performances of some kind or other that they have to monitor. And that once the BBC decided, I remember when it was on Channel 4 Glastonbury, and it wasn't that big a deal. It was kind of like, BBC reluctantly got the rights for it almost. Yeah. And now they've turned this into this kind of annual, obviously it's taking a rest next year, but a massive annual thing for the BBC to show what it can do, I think.
Absolutely.
And so they have on iPlayer, they have a channel on every stage, all the stages, live. Absolutely, pretty much, I'm a tiny delay maybe. But all the performances you see on BBC One and BBC Two are delayed, So the so-called team time slot that Rod Stewart did ended up being on BBC One at 7:30 in the evening. But it actually went on at 5 o'clock, But I'm making that point merely that you can watch all this stuff live on the iPlayer. And they can't stop, if Bob Villan wants to start talking about Palestine, well, who can stop him, And so it's almost like geared up.
But they could have stopped the broadcast, couldn't they?
Yeah, once it started, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Because the thing that struck me was that they knew that Kneecap was, potentially going to be an incendiary thing, and so they made sure that they weren't doing that live. But I think with Bob Villan, I think they just didn't anticipate that this was going to happen.
No.
The issue was that when it did happen, was there just nobody senior enough to make a decision about it, or did they not realise the
Shall I tell you my theory?
The extent of what he was saying.
Okay, my theory about BBC management, and I've known a lot of BBC management in my time. They are people who always wanted to play with the cool kids, who always wanted to do what the cool kids wanted to do. They were the people who organised the shows at school in order to get in with the cool kids. And they always come to grief by letting the cool kids have their way. There have been so many cases of this. Russell Brand at Radio 2, that whole business was because Leslie Douglas wouldn't rein him in. Nobody would say, that's enough of that. Stop that.
They'd always go, that's Russell being Russell.
Or whatever. They'll always do that. And therefore these things will tend to come back to haunt them. And you do have this problem with kind of musical acts. As you say, there's 4,000 or whatever, there's 2,000. if you tell them where the line is, there's always going to be 10 of them who are going to say, well, I'm going to go over that line, whatever that line is.
Or make a decision to go over the line because they've been told they shouldn't. Because, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Bob Villan, who, to be fair, I'd never heard of, actually, before this event.
Yeah, but I think that's the point, actually. I don't think many people have heard of Bob Villan, I have to say, and I think that is the difference. I guarantee you, they have now. But I think the people responsible just thought, oh, who's that? Some very obscure person I've never heard of. It sounds like a joke act as well.
I know. I saw one BBC report which referred to him as Bob Violin, which I thought was even funny. Right. They didn't even get the really tenuous and pathetic gag.
Yeah. I think they just thought, oh, that's some obscure, comedy act or whatever. Whatever they're doing, we'll leave them to it. No one will notice. I bet they just thought no one will notice, even though it's falling for the death. Yeah.
5 years ago, if you had a comedy meeting, for a program, and somebody you'd heard that there's going to be an act called Kneecap, and then there's going to be Bob Villan. You'd have thought that's Armando Iannucci just making up stuff. It can't be as ridiculous as that. But that's the way it ends.
I also think they were so focused on Kneecap as well that I think they were diverted by that. I think their attention was fully on. I think everyone was stressed out about what's Kneecap going to do.
That was the one thing they were concentrating on. And the other embarrassment was that Tim Davie, the controller, actually was at Glastonbury, wasn't he?
No, of course.
He was there. And I kind of, people are kind of thinking, well, why didn't he help? Well, Tim Davie, I mean, let's be honest, must have been deep in corporate hospitality at that point, behind a wicket fence with a flute of fine champagne and a canapé.
All the newspaper accounts said he was visiting staff. Oh, bugger off!
But the other thing that was happening, by the way, that I think might have contributed is they were doing negotiations with Neil Young, right? The story, Neil Young. First of all, I think the whole story of Neil Young Glastonbury is hilarious because Neil Young, please do Glastonbury. Michael Eavis particularly loves him, one of his favourite acts. Quite right, one of my favourite acts, absolute legend. And he goes, no, it's too corporate now. No, he agrees to do it. Then he backs out and says it's too corporate now. Then he changes his mind and goes, no, I will do it. But then he won't let the BBC show his performance, right?
Yeah, but he did say he was going to pull out. He agreed to pull out. And said, I'm pulling out because it's being televised.
Right, now listen, in all the listing, I know this because I deal with TV listings and I did there's no mention of Neil Young in the BBC's coverage at all because they can't, because he hasn't agreed to let them do it. Then on the day, then they're still negotiating with him and they're still saying, come on, let's show this. And he agrees in the end, like literally a couple of hours before he went on to let the BBC show his whole performance on BBC 4 iPlayer or whatever. And I think that negotiation must have taken a lot of seniors, a lot of suits to deal with. Meanwhile, Bob Villan
he's making merry.
Yeah. So, that's my theory. I like to think that's what happened, but I have no actual proof. But definitely that Neil Young thing changed throughout the day. Are we going to see him? Aren't we going to see him? I was completely taken up with that. I really need to see your Neil Young. For me, that was the diversion that might have enabled the Bob Villan fiasco.
So what was your favourite bit, Mark? You watched a lot of Glastonbury.
My favourite bit, my goodness. I think Pulp. Pulp were amazing. I thought they were good. I thought...
you were telling me about Rod Stewart.
I thought Rod Stewart was extraordinary. Did you see Rod Stewart, Boyd?
Yes.
Because I started watching Rod Stewart and then I became absolutely just enthralled by it because Rod Stewart put on the most old school 1970s show you felt you had dropped through a wormhole in time. And here was this guy doing what all pop singers and rock stars do the older they get, which is provide more and more distraction. So usually that expresses itself in lasers and screens and lights and spectacle and props. But in his case, it was a grand total, I think, of 11 or 12 identical height and all extraordinarily attractive girls.
Yes.
There was an orchestra of about 6. Then there was 4 or 5 musicians, all in their red cocktail dresses and their red high heel shoes, and 3 blonde backing girls who were just, and they were really fantastic to watch because they smiled throughout the entire thing for an hour and a half. They were just having the best time imaginable. And it was beautifully choreographed and incredibly funny. And of course, the reaction, I had a look afterwards, and the reaction was that completely divided the audience. Old school people who just didn't see that as being embarrassing at all. Like myself, I just thought it was really funny and really well performed. performed, and far more of a spectacle than a lot of other stuff you'd seen, which is just self-interested people staring at their feet and playing guitars. They thought it was great. But anybody under 40, outraged. Yeah. A man singing about, in the morning, don't tell me you love me, or I'll just kick you out the door, surrounded by girls in cocktail dresses.
It was such a throwback, wasn't it? It reminded me of, the Addicted to Love video. It was like that all over again.
Right,
you remember? Well, when it had buxom women kind of playing the guitar. And in this, the fact that they all looked the same. He picked tall, blonde women to
they
be
were the same height.
The same height, exactly.
Identical height.
And I think people have. My gen, I kind of thought, it's Rod, just let him do what he wants to do. It's fine. It's Rod Stewart. He kind of gets away with a lot. And I think if it had been in a different context, it would have been excruciating. And I was surprised by how little controversy there was about that, to be honest, because people were like, it's Rod Stewart, he's having a good time. He's having his band members made up of people he finds attractive. Well, it's fine. We'll let him do that. So, it was very funny. It was very funny to watch that.
I love the way that he had 3 surprise guests. He had Lulu, he had Ronnie Wood, and he had Mick Hucknall, Mickey Boy. Yeah. Which was terribly disappointing, I thought. But anyway, and then he made the terrible mistake of telling people to announce who his special guests were, and then he announced them himself.
Right, I agree.
Went on stage, they'd already presented us before and said, by the way, look out for Rod, because he's going to have Lulu on. He went and said, later on, we've got our surprise guests, I think he says. Lulu?
Yeah.
Well,
you're right, yeah.
The element of surprise has been slightly punctured here.
Yeah, that was completely mad. You're absolutely right. It was.
What was your high spot, Boyd?
Well, it was Neil Young. I mean, Neil Young basically just did, he did 2 tracks from Green Day.
God. That's Neil.
Yeah, I did. The set list was annoying to a large extent, but there was still absolute pearls in there. Doing The Needle and The Damage Done. Neil, he did a couple of songs, just him and the guitar, pretty much, which were beautiful as you'd expect. And in the end, even though he was kind of like, he just seemed to he's doing Hyde Park this weekend, I believe. So it's just a stop on his tour. It felt like, to start with, at least. But then as it wore on, I think as the enormity of the crowd, people said it was a smaller crowd than, I'm sure it was a smaller crowd than Elton John or whatever a couple of years ago. But it was still hundreds of thousands of people. And I still don't think Neil Young is used to performing in front of hundreds of thousands of people.
I'm sure he isn't.
So by the end of it, he looked thrilled and he was kind of delighted. And Like a Hurricane, I think, was probably my highlight, because you were talking before about, the sound and the spectacle of a song. If Like a Hurricane, for me, is like one of the most spectacular sounding songs of all time. And they pulled the stops out, and it was fantastic. So that was my highlight. And then on the kind of like a wryly funny highlight, the 1975, who I'm fine, I don't mind them. I'm not particularly fan, but I think that I can see why people love them. But Matt Healy, that kind of walking on stage with a pint of Guinness and a fag.
I saw that. Yeah.
It was hilarious. It reminded me of all the things you two often talk about on this podcast, of rock musicians looking like absolute idiots, and they think that it's trying to be as cool as possible. A pint of Guinness that he barely ever sipped at,
I couldn't believe that. He arrived with his pint of Guinness and he holds it up to the crowd saying, like, I'm just like you, and I'm a little bit pissed. And he did look a bit pissed. And he starts going out on one of those walkways, and of course he's still got the pint of Guinness. He can't put the pint of Guinness down, and it's full, isn't it? Can't put it down, and he keeps having to kind of drink it to kind of lessen his load, because otherwise he's just spilling it everywhere.
And he's got the fag, and he's also got the fag. It's kind of like,
he did have a pork pie and some scratchings as well.
It was hilarious, honestly. It was absolutely hilarious. It was like a kind of comedy film version of Glastonbury. So that was very entertaining.
So final thought. Who's going to play Glastonbury in 2 years' time? Who's left? Have all the legends done it?
That's a good question.
Sorry,
when's the last time Bruce Springsteen did it? I wonder.
I saw the last time.
He was not.
Was it would have been long ago.
And he appeared with Paul McCartney.
Right. That's right. Yeah, yes, he did. Yeah.
So it just strikes me when these things happen. I think these things must be increasingly unremarkable. You know, because going back to your Live Aid thing, it was unprecedented. Well, everything's precedented.
Yeah.
Now,
has Madonna done Live Aid? I guess she has.
You mean done Glastonbury?
Glastonbury, yeah. I don't think so.
No.
But you're right. I mean, virtually everybody has been picked off in the end, haven't they?
Yeah.
Stones have done it,
Did you see that very sweet picture snapped backstage of Paul McCartney with Frank Allen and John McNally of the Searchers, for whom it was their last ever gig?
Wow.
So, Paul McCartney was in the Beatles, joined the Beatles at the time that Frank Allen started the Searchers. And there they were at Glastonbury. Paul McCartney was just visiting. And that was the Searchers' last ever gig. They retired after Glastonbury. I thought it was very sweet.
I know, and you wondered why he was there, McCartney, because he never played with anybody in the end.
Well, he goes.
He likes
going. Being on the side of the stage for Inhaler, which is the group by Bono's son, and but they didn't. I think he just goes, doesn't he? I think
he goes.
Likes it.
What about Bob Dylan? Has Bob Dylan? When's the last time Bob Dylan did Glastonbury? Has he ever done Glastonbury?
Yes, he has. I've seen him there. Yeah,
okay. But years
ago,
only
once. I think only once.
Yeah.
And I think it was, if I remember right, I think it was almost early evening. It wasn't even kind of a headline slot,
Wow. I think now it would be a big deal particularly because of the film. The film was a big hit.
Maybe.
Huge.
So what's the best thing to have at Glastonbury in 2 years' time? Bob Dylan, if he's still playing, whatever, or Timothy Chalamet doing Bob Dylan?
Well, the rumor was that Timothy Chalamet was going to do a set of Bob Dylan songs. That was a big rumor.
That didn't happen.
Yeah, that didn't happen. No, but I think it was. Yeah, I don't know why, but I think that was on the verge of happening. It was definitely a thing that nearly happened.
That's a good idea. Yeah. And they should have the 4 actors who play the Beatles in the upcoming Beatles thing doing the Beatles. That's the future, And that's my prediction. Boyd, thank you very much indeed for joining.
Oh, absolute pleasure, joy. Thank you.
And we've marked everybody's card on the subject of live entertainment 40 years after Live Aid. Thanks very much.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.